Hi, morning everyone. Hi, this is Shiv Someshwar from Columbia University on the Global Classroom for Foundations for Sustainable Development Practice. So good morning, afternoon, evening to all of you. Today I'm really pleased to have Aromar Revi from the Indian Institute of Human Settlements based in Bangalore as well as Delhi. He's an outstanding educator, practitioner, analyst, policy planner. He is patiently waiting in Bangalore to come in on Google Hangout. And sorry to say, we're not going to be able to also in parallel conduct the Skype session today for some technical issues. So today, Aro is going to be walking us through the importance of, not just the importance of cities, the patterns of human settlements, this whole idea that he, along with several others, led the charge to make sure that we have an urban sustainable development goal and the reasons thereof. And now, given that we have an SDG, what are some of the next steps? What are some of the critical steps that we need to pursue over the coming months and years in order to realize the hopes and aspirations that we had in ensuring an SDG? So, Aro, over to you. And now I know that you have to rush off to catch a flight. So we have exactly 55 minutes from now. You'll be leaving. So the global classroom today will end at 9 o'clock US East Coast time. And thank you, Aro, for coming in. Shweta?
Yeah, thanks, Shiv. I'm actually in Delhi and not in Bangalore. I'm going to be flying to Bangalore in about
okay. Let me redo the introduction all over again then. And many of you would have seen Aro here just last week. He was here. He was here for the tumultuous week where we kind of actually passed the SDGs. So lovely.
Okay, good. Thanks. Ready to go?
Yeah. Thanks.
So nice to be with all of you. I'm just going to sort of run you through my slides, and we'll sort of use that as the basis to run this conversation. I'm going to run you through a whole range of things. I mean, those of you who've been following progress in this area, this is the new set of SDGs which we sort of signed up for on the 25th of last month. There's 17 of them, a little too many, I would imagine. But as far as we're concerned today, the fairly important one is Goal 11, which you can see up there, second row, one from the extreme right, Sustainable Cities and Communities. There are 17 of them. Of course, the interesting thing about these goals is that as far as cities are concerned, it's not 11 that is the only one that we're interested in. It's a whole range of other things that are actually quite critical for us to deal with. So if you try and understand where these challenges come from, I'm going to take you through a whole range of different ideas from different parts of the world, including South Asia. This is an image from South Asia, but also from East Asia, from Africa, and of course from North America. I guess the challenge that we're dealing with here, and we're dealing with questions of sustainability, especially in the global South, is integrating a whole range of different phases and processes. So this is an image from New Delhi, the city that I'm in at the moment. This is an image of the Red Fort, which is an old Mughal fort, which shows you the typical challenges that we have. This is a pre-colonial fort built in the 17th century. In the background behind that, you see some buildings which are old colonial British buildings. And in the far background, you see sort of modern India sort of emerging. Plus, there are a whole range of things you can't necessarily see in this photograph, which is where the informal settlements lie just behind this large fort. So the challenge that we have in many places is trying to keep the balance and the integration between, in a sense, all of these different parts of history. So sustainability is not only about dealing with now, but dealing with a whole range of historical questions and changes. So this is a very simple mnemonic. It comes from a fairly famous paper that was done by a friend of mine many years ago. Daniela Meadows, she's a fairly famous system scientist. And the question that she's asking is, when you intervene in a system, like in the world system or the sort of economic system or in a social system, how do you try and assess whether you're making a significant difference? how does one enable tremendous structural change or transformation, which is what in some senses the Sustainable Development Goals are about. And if you look at them from bottom up, in terms of the processes that make the biggest difference, the most important and most powerful thing, of course, is the power to transcend paradigms, to move from one paradigm to the other. Of course, if you want to make structural changes, we can see in many parts of the world, including the crises that are currently happening in China and, let's say, in Europe in terms of economic development, the mindset that sort of drives the way the system functions, the way we relate to things, like, for example, questions of climate change and consumption. And then, of course, something that's a little less powerful than changing the mindset is actually changing the goals of the system. So you can see in this set of 12 different places in which you can effect systemic change, changing the goals of the system is a very, very important and very powerful way to change things around. It's very rare that one has the opportunity to actually enable this kind of systemic change, which is exactly why the SDGs, even though they took 3 years to sort of sort out, were very important. And the fact that we've been able to bring cities and sustainable urbanization into that framework is, in some senses, a reflection of our aspiration to make significant structural change. So what is the context? I guess the core context is that the 21st century may be very different from the long 20th century. And this is an image from Scandinavia, which shows you, how the landscape effectively will change as we move to much more sort of, to different forms of production, to new forms of energy generation. These are the sort of 2 megawatt plus wind turbines that you see in many parts of Scandinavia, and of course in some parts of the United States. This, of course, is constrained, and you would have heard this, I guess, in earlier discussions on planetary boundaries. The fundamental constraint is that there is only one Earth, and this Earth, of course, as as our astronaut showed us in the 1960s, is in a very small corner of the known universe. The context, of course, that we're dealing with these goals is national development. This is a long-range trajectory, a long-range plot of the share of global economic output of major economies in the world, starting from the 16th century all the way to projections for the 2050s. And what you can see here is, if you look at the 18th and the 19th century, India and China, which are now very relatively poor countries compared to other parts of the world, made up about 50% of the world's economic output. So this is important to understand, because the new wave of urbanization that we're going to be seeing, or is currently underway, is significantly driven by geographies. And the historical centers that we've seen over the last 150 years of urbanization, including New York, are no longer going to be the centers or the epicenters of both innovation and change. In fact, the battle for sustainability, by and large, will be won and fought in Chinese and, I would say, South Asian cities. And you have to look at these things a little bit sort of in a contrarian frame. If you can see this properly, this is a map of the globe, a satellite image of the globe, but not the normal way that we look at it. And what you can see here, if you look at the night lights, is that if you actually invert the way that we look at the world, things are actually quite different. The red circles represent the centers of the world system in the late 19th and earlier 20th centuries. That's the sort of North Atlantic engagement that's there, and of course, much of the lights that you see are actually cities. And then the green areas are the emerging markets in some senses, or the centers of the global economy, and of course certainly global population at the current point of time. And the ovals that you see in yellow are the emerging centers. So we often don't think of, let's say, Indonesia or the Middle East as significant areas which are very important in terms of long-term urbanization, or Nigeria for that matter, as a country which is going to have a very large urban population. So this is a quick snapshot of how history and geography come together. The center of the world system is no longer around the sort of eastern coast of the United States and Western Europe. It has actually moved to the Pacific coast and to China maybe 10 or 15 years ago. So the question, of course, for us is, do these new geographies, will they actually make new histories? The other big question for us is climate change. These are a couple of images from the IPCC Assessment Report 5. that we produced last year, and you can see there's a whole range of uncertainties about, if you look at the left-hand graph, of how climate scenarios may actually play themselves out over the next many years. Again, I imagine people have talked to you about this in quite some detail. We made some significant progress on this, both from the STSN side, and of course because the Chinese and the US presidents about a week ago made a strong commitment to deep decarbonization. But of course, a key thing for us to understand is on the right-hand side of the slide, where you can see that a whole range of systems are already starting to be impacted. Unique and threatened systems are clearly under impact. And as we move potentially into a world that is more than, let's say, 2 degrees Celsius, this line here, you can see the whole range of other systems may actually be impacted quite strongly. So if we're looking at the 21st century and the challenges of a sustainability transition, there are 3 or 4 things that we must understand. If we look at current levels of consumption, and of course the OECD is essentially involved in this, but it will also emerge as the middle class grows in other parts of the world. Present consumption requires about 2 times the current world natural product, what ecosystems can provide for us. 21st century population growth, which will probably touch somewhere between 9 and 10 billion from about the 7 billion that we have just now, will require an increase of about 1.5 times the current product. And of course, the question that I'm most concerned with, which is ending poverty at present throughput, which of course is goal 1 within the SDG frame, will actually potentially require about 2 worlds of output. So if you add all 3 of them together, we have 5.5 worlds in terms of ecological output that can be sustained. We only have 1. So I guess the core challenge of the 21st century, in which urbanization is going to be a very important theme, a very important theme, is going to be trying to see how we can actually manage this process of dealing with poverty, dealing with inequality, and dealing with entitlements to everybody, in spite of the fact that we're seriously constrained on the resource front. So I guess the question that we have then is, why are cities important? I mean, we've lived with cities for 5,000 years, but is there a particular moment in history at the moment which actually gives us some interesting insights? Let me give you a quick snapshot. This is a quick snapshot of historical urbanization over the last century or so. That's the world in 1900, population of 1.5 billion, urban share just 13%. The gross world product, was roughly 2 trillion at 2012 prices, and the urban share of the world product was about 30%. Right? Let me jump you, and you can see where the urban centers are at that point of time. As you can see, obviously Western Europe and the Eastern Seaboard of the US are quite important. You find a few other cities in Asia, a little bit in Latin America. You can see Buenos Aires there. You can see other parts. Now let me jump into the end of the Second World War, the beginning of the United Nations, 1950. Urban population now jumping to 2.5 billion. The urban share of total population is 29%. The gross world product going from about 3 trillion to 7 trillion in equivalent price terms over that period of time. But the urban share jumping now to about 45%. And you can see the growth of urbanization both in the Americas, especially in North America, in Europe, and the beginnings of a significant expansion in Asia. That's the world in 2013, 7 billion people, urban share 50%, gross world product 70 trillion. So this massive increase of almost 10 times in world product, and the urban share now of world product rising to about above two-thirds and moving its way up to about 3/4, which is what you'll see here. This is a projection from the UN population, the world in 2025, population of about 8 billion, about 58% of this population living in urban centers. Remember from this image, these are only urban agglomerations of more than 750,000 people. A lot of people live in places that are much smaller than this. So this gives you a somewhat false sense, but if I laid out all the cities in the world, you would not be able to see the map. The most important thing, of course, is that the gross world product is expected to be about 85 trillion, of which the urban share is 75%. So in effect, cities have been driving the world economy for a long period of time, certainly since the Second World War, since the 1950s, since the United Nations was actually created. And even though we have got some salience now since 2008, when the UN population effectively said the world is half urban in population terms, but in practice, the global economy has been more than half urban since the mid-late 1980s. So It really is, in some ways, economic development that's actually bringing cities into the sort of forefront as far as we're concerned. Now, if we look into the future, look at 2025, and look at the location of cities across the world, what you see here is very interesting. The browns are actually Asian cities. So if you look at the top 5, you have Tokyo, Delhi, Shanghai, and Mumbai. Then you have Mexico City as number 5, and you have New York as number 6. So if you look at Europe, for example, the first big European city that's in this list comes way down in the sort of post-25 block when you have Moscow and Paris. So the geography of urbanization is changing dramatically. Much of this is actually happening in Asia. This is one thing that the world is still not completely come to grips with. So what does it mean in process? Especially if you're looking at urbanization in the global south, there are 8 things that are happening simultaneously. There's obviously a demographic transition that's happening. There's a health transition that's happening, from infectious to lifestyle disease burden. There's a big education transition that's happening. It's sort of affected in many parts of East Asia, but it's happening now in Sub-Saharan Africa and also in South Asian cities. There's a significant energy transition, hopefully from oil and coal to gas and renewables, especially if the decarbonization pathways that we're talking about are effective. The challenge for many cities that we will see this transition in is that they will be simultaneously dealing with the brown, gray, and green environmental transition agendas simultaneously. It's not, I guess, like it is or was in Western Europe and in North America. And of course, all of us are part of this dramatic information transition. Not only cell phones, but smartphones and the web being ubiquitous with 4G connectivity. And in India, for example, we have more than 800 million people with cell phones at the moment. So a key driver of that, and of course the traditional development transition from agrarian to hopefully green manufacturing and knowledge-based jobs. So what we're saying is cities are important is because all of these things, especially in cities of the global south, are happening simultaneously. And the challenge of managing sustainable development is actually to affect sustainability along all its 3 pillars, the ecological or environmental, the social, and the economic, around 8 of these critical transitions. That is a dramatic challenge that's not easy for us to deal with. So in some senses, urbanization is just not a megatrend, it's actually a gigatrend. It's a millennium transformation of human culture, society, the economy, polity, and planetary systems. We often forget and we don't put enough emphasis on the question of human culture, but actually urbanization is fundamentally a cultural shift and less, a technical shift in some ways, or even an economic shift. So I guess one question, and this is of course looking at Midtown, is this kind of urbanization inevitable? Is this the terminal form of urbanization that we expect to see across the world? And is this as far as we can get? There's a long debate that we've been having with colleagues in China and notably in some other parts of Asia about whether this is the way that the world will go. Some people are quite strong about this and essentially have articulated the fact that New York itself, even though it's a wonderful city, it's greening itself, and we have Plan NY and One NY, etc., etc. In its fundamental form, it's not a very sustainable city, and we look at that clearly. So if we look at other cities, New York is relatively young compared to other cities that have existed for 1,000+ years. Let's look a little bit at history. This is an example from India. It's 5,000+ years old. You can see the top there. It's from 25. The city is called Dholavira. It was relatively small. It would be a town in today's context, but it survived for over 1,000 years. And more interesting than that, the vagaries of changes in climate, and you can see that here, actually played itself out in the history of this river port. This is one of the more important ports and citadels of the Indus Valley civilization. Again, very small population, 100 hectares. Much of this would fit into one part, or at least it would overlap with some part of Central Park. But the interesting thing for us to understand is when we're looking at the long-range trend, urban sustainability is not something that is to be dealt with in 1 or 2 generations. It is a process, or it is we're talking about processes that will play themselves over a millennium timeline, and we do have examples of that and this is a classic example of adaptation as this particular city faced serious droughts about 3,000 years ago. Another example, a great world city of the 16th century that was almost the size of Venice at that point of time. It was bigger than Lisbon, bigger than London, and you can see the population there in 1550, almost 400,000 people. But it actually collapsed. You find in a period of 150 years, the city became, it was abandoned. And why was it abandoned? It was abandoned because it was infected by cholera, typhoid, and of course the plague. Because what people didn't realize at that point of time is that it's not good enough to become extremely wealthy like the city was. It had 2 universities at that point in time, a fantastic hospital, and of course one of the largest arsenals in the world outside Venice. The black ship sailed from here. What people forgot, the Portuguese forgot at that point in time, is that the environment is absolutely critical. This is a very dense settlement. It had cesspools and it had water that was drawn from wells, and of course there was feedback between those two systems, and lots of people died. So it eventually was depopulated. This is what you see at the moment. This is a very, very important cathedral, which would normally have sat within the square, but essentially everything else is gone here, and the only thing that's left is the old churches. On the other hand, Mumbai, which will be, let's say, number 3 in the world in 2025, already in the top 10 cities in the world, we find over 6 million people living in informal settlements and slums. So this is the other, the brown areas you can see on the map there are the areas that are in which people live in informal settlements. So you can see even a city of this scale, city that's relatively well off compared to other Indian cities, there are a whole range of dramatic challenges, especially on the economic and the social side, that also threaten sustainability. And then the big challenge that we're going to face over the next, the latter part of the century. This is temperature trends over the last century between 1901 and 2012, and you can see here the major urban centers that I showed you earlier, mapped on a plot of temperature change. The temperature changes that you can see are between 1, the reds are between 1 and let's say 1.7 degrees. This is the most optimistic scenario from the IPCC last year. This is if we are able to actually effect an effective lockdown in Paris at the end of the year and move to a dramatic reduction, maybe up to 80% in some economies, of carbon emissions based on 1990 base. That's where things are, and you can see already, especially some cities in this part of the world, and including in the United States and Canada, that there are relatively significant changes in mean temperatures. This is, of course, the nightmare worst-case scenario, where climate change goes way out of line, and you can see the purples at the top. These are at the poles. We're talking about a 6-degree change here, and you can see significant changes across the world and impacts obviously on cities. So climate is a very important consideration. New York is somewhere down here. That's London, etc. That's Paris on this side. Okay, so the question is, given all these constraints, is it really possible to do what we're trying to do in the Sustainable Development Goals? Is this idea of urban transformation possible? Or can it only be done in particular directions or along particular axes? So let me show you some evidence. This is Shanghai, 1987, and an image quite recent from more or less the same location. And look at the dramatic difference. So, if you want to see how things can transform themselves, at least economically in terms of the built environment, you have to go back and forth between these two images. So obviously, in some parts of the world, depending on how the economy works, how capital is concentrated, and a whole range of other things, including technology, etc., things can be dramatically different. They can actually change quite significantly. But the question for us, of course, is how can this local transformation be linked to a global urban transformation? This is a very nice image, one of my nicer images from Rio. There are 5 critical things that we need to do to address this, and this reflects itself in the debate that we've had over the last 3 years on urban sustainability. The first thing is we have to ask the question of whether it's rural plus urban or whether we can bring the two together. The second, of course, is a challenge between managing things from the nation state as national economies. The goals that were decided on a few days ago were focused on national goals, but we know that cities are very important in dealing with delivery on the ground. So regional and local governments, that's regional and municipal governments, mayors are very important. And We brought together some of the more interesting mayors across the world on the 24th. And then the question of present versus future benefit. How does one deal with poverty at the current point of time, vis-a-vis a trade-off, in the future? For example, you could bring down unemployment, today, but it may have a dramatic impact in terms of what will happen to poverty in the future. Similarly, questions of poverty and inequality are very critical. And of course, one other question is, how do you provide precedence to capital? Does physical capital and financial capital take precedence over natural capital? So these are 5 central dichotomies that we have to deal with, both in dealing with sustainable urbanization, but also in dealing with questions of sustainable development. This is a quick section. I just fly over it because I think you're fairly familiar with it. The difference between the MDGs and the SDGs. Of course, the SDGs deal with the historical agenda the MDGs left over, but there's a fundamental difference, and that is that the SDGs are focused on universal goals for everybody, everywhere. And this is a huge, huge new thing, especially as far as cities are concerned, because it creates new windows of opportunities and new actors at the table. And as you will see very quickly, it does require new global governance architecture. So the question for us is, how does this play itself out? I'll just flip through this very, very quickly. Why do the SDGs, and especially as far as urban is concerned, what do they give us? They give us both intergenerational and intergenerational equity. So it sort of hopefully brings them both together. It gives voice to the concerns of people who are there and them, people who are excluded. And of course, it tries to maintain the balance of power between different spheres and scales of government, the local, that is the mayors, the regional governors, and of course, national governments. It critically deals with questions of global commons and also the global financial system, if we are going to actually finance this. So it really is about establishing a new governance architecture that balances the interests of the nation states, cities and regional governments, firms, of course, because they're a key driver of the global economy at the current point of time. And of course, centrally at the heart of that is the right of communities and citizens to keep things going. So when we started this process about 2 years ago, this was the framework that SDSN had presented. 10 goals, simple, straightforward. And of course, what I've highlighted here is 6 and 7 at that point of time, which was dealing with agriculture and rural prosperity and cities. And the way that we had actually positioned it, and this is a great loss that we've seen in the negotiation in the UN, is that these two goals actually sit back to back. You cannot have sustainable cities unless you have sustainable agriculture and rural prosperity. And on the other hand, you can't actually move large number of people out of rural poverty, as you've seen in China, without having cities that actually respond to them. Unfortunately, in the negotiations, we lost this framing, and in some senses, I think both the goals and certainly as far as rural development is concerned, we have an impoverishment of process. So we pushed, as you've alluded to, over a period of almost 2.5 years, for a standalone goal. There was a lot of pushback in the beginning, saying, why should cities actually have a special focus on this? Urbanization is a process, it should be integrated with everything else. But what we said was that these goals were really a 21st century idea whose time had come. I would say there are a couple of significant goals that are very 21st century. Climate is one of them, and the urbanization is certainly the other one. We brought together a whole range of different agencies who had never worked together for a long time to form a campaign. We brought together over 200 cities, regional governments, a whole range of other actors to build a massive campaign across the world to make this happen. And there was a lot of debate. That's me at the United Nations Open Working Group. And then we actually tried to show people. This is a classic, very simple thing. I'll show it to you for a very, very short period of time. I presented this actually at the General Assembly to try and show, if you start applying this framework to two very different cities, how would it play itself out? So we compared Bangalore and New York on dealing with economic development questions of poverty, etc. And what you see here from this multidimensional index, that there are some things, for example, that New York is not doing very well on. In fact, Bangalore may be doing somewhat better. Let's say on workforce participation, as you can see here, there's better female workforce participation in Bangalore than in some parts of New York City. So the interesting thing is, when you start running these comparisons at city by city level across the world, you find that many parts of the OECD, and a recent report has shown that also, that even in the OECD countries, readiness for the SDGs is quite limited in some parts of the world. And the United States is one of those particular locations. Some parts are better organized than others. That's looking at economic development questions. This is looking at a whole range of environmental questions, housing, basic services, and of course New York is much better than Bangalore in many cases. But you'd find that, for example, on internet access, there's been a dramatic change that you've seen in the last few years, even in India. And then finally on environmental questions, and of course this is a classic example. There was a roar of laughter in the UN when I showed this. Basically, because if you look at Manhattan, especially on the green side, Central Park and a few other things, is very little compared to a city like Bangalore, which is Shiv knows that quite well. He comes and his family spends some time in Bangalore. It's a city of gardens. So even in these two comparisons, you can see on the same indices, some cities, even though they might be quite rich, are actually challenged on other counts. So this is just a quick comparison. We're doing this with cities across the world, about 20 plus of them, to try and see how we can move forward. So there was a great debate that went on, and then we got these 17 goals, including goal 11. Now, and of course, this is the articulation that we have from last week of all the 17 goals. Let me try and show you what it actually means in practice. What it means in practice is, we have agreed that we will provide, all the countries in the world, when I say we, it's 193 countries, the heads of states that have signed up to this, we will provide in urban areas education and healthcare for all 5 billion urban citizens by 2030. That's a huge, huge deal. This has never been done before in all of human history, and we expect to actually roll this out in the next 15 years. Similarly, at least 1 billion people to move out from slums and informal settlements into secure housing and adequate services. A huge challenge. If you divide this 1 billion by 15 years on an annualized basis, that's a very large number. 600 million meaningful new jobs with better working conditions in urban areas. Forget about rural areas. That's about 20 odd million new jobs every year across the world. This is going to be a very, very significant challenge, and I'm wondering how we can actually pull it off. But if this happens, this is actually going to transform the world in some senses. And of course, we have to build resilience, especially because Goal 11 focuses on that, and address the informal sector, because in a country like India, 25% of the gross domestic product actually comes from the urban informal sector. So we're trying to build resilience and address informality in a $90 trillion urban economy. So the great opportunity, of course, is there's this tremendous economic sort of churn that's taking place, even though parts of the world economy are slowing at the current point in time. But the incremental value addition that comes from cities is very large. So it's that will give us the impetus to be able to both enable the investment, and if the governance is right and the investment is right in human development, in social development and sustainability, to actually drive things further. So in practice, and I won't take you through this is too much of technical stuff that's there. The goal 11, or the sustainable development SDG 11, is sort of broken up into 7 targets. They're up there. I just highlight some of the big words there. So basically, adequate, safe, and affordable housing and basic services. This is something which is which even New York is struggling with. The current mayor, de Blasio, when we've had conversations, this is one of his most critical challenges he has. Similarly, dealing with sustainable transportation systems. There again, New York is much better. Many other parts of the world are not so good. But sustainable transport is a key question that's there. Human settlements planning, and this is not an easy thing to do, especially for rapidly changing cities. Protecting cultural and natural heritage, and then of course a whole range of things to deal with disasters. And of course, we had the mayor of New Orleans speaking to this on the 24th, and the impact of Katrina and how things actually did or did not change after that, and how, in a sense, what the vulnerability that came before Katrina is really a very significant reason for New Orleans and many other cities in the U.S., as of course in other parts of the world, to actually focus on trying to improve, sustainable development in cities for a long time. So these are a whole range of other things on implementation questions. So what may we be missing from this framework? The first thing, and I guess this is my personal take on it, there are too many goals, too many targets and indicators. It's going to be tough. So one of the big debates we've been having in the last couple of weeks is, should we just focus on the urban as it's articulated in the goal, or should we pick up on other questions? Should we pick up on questions of urban-rural linkages? Should we pick up on questions of education and healthcare? Should we pick up on questions of water and energy, which are all part of the everyday work that mayors do, or should we sort of let them go, or let them go? And then, like I said earlier, the linkage between cities, productivity, employment, and poverty reduction has unfortunately been broken in the current framework in the way it was actually negotiated. And of course, the big tragedy, because many of us have worked on rural questions for a long time, the linkage between urban development, sustainable cities, and rural prosperity and development seems to be broken. So there are a few of these questions that need to be addressed. I would imagine in the next couple of years or so, as we start looking at operationalization, we will find that we have to address these questions quite critically. So of course, the big challenge for us is, how do we implement this? How do we get this through? I will very quickly whip you through an example from South Africa. This is of course one of the the areas just outside of Cape Town. This is an early stage of how South Africa is responding to this question by building what they call an integrated urban development framework, which links national level processes to what's happening in provinces and states, and from that to cities. So the question, of course, here is, and this was actually created about a year ago, before the SDGs came into place, how do you actually bring all these things together? They identified 4 strategic goals: enabling access for everybody. Remember, South Africa is still only 20 years after apartheid, and apartheid was effectively delivered in some senses by segregation in cities. So access is very, very important, because even now South African cities are highly segregated by race. Growth, of course, is important, especially in places where poverty and redistribution are issues. Governance is a central question. And finally, if you're not able to translate this into a spatial transformation to deal with questions of sprawl, questions of peripheralization of poor people, of inner city blight, etc. And then they identify, I think, something like 10 or 11 different levers to focus and deliver on this thing. Those are the strategic priorities. That's how the policies are actually organized. And then, very, very quickly, you can see what the policy lever is and how you're actually going to try and, for example, in the case of mobility, to enhance mobility and connectivity by providing grid access, reducing travel time and cost, and reducing emissions. So, these have all been worked out in quite some detail, just giving you a sense of how all of them are tied together. You'll see, for example, integrated planning, which is target 11.3 in the SDGs, etc. So there are a whole range of them. As you bring your stuff down, I'm just going to fly through it. It's in your slides. And then I'll sort of try and quickly wrap up with, fair enough, that gives you an idea of a fact that you have to build a multi-level frame that goes from national level right down to state level, and from state level to city. I'll just take you through a very, very quick piece of work that we had done over the last year or so, looking at one of the provinces in India, a province called Andhra Pradesh, that was actually being bifurcated. This is a map that shows you all the places in Andhra Pradesh. The yellow ones are the villages, the red ones are the larger urban centers. So you've got to basically figure out where everything is in space. You have to look at how economic activity plays itself out. This looks at the economy in different sectors, what is growing, what is not. In this case, for example, trade is going relatively quickly, and manufacturing is not growing very fast. This is the green line that's there. And then you look at the relationship between work on this side and economic output. So, are you creating enough jobs from a particular investment that you have? Then you look at this question regionally. So there are 3 different regions in the state, and you can see, of course, considerable differences in the economic output levels. The northern region is much more productive compared to the inland southern region, which is very poor. And then, of course, you look at environmental questions. It maps the environment across the state. You look at infrastructure. This particularly looks at both hydro and thermal power plants, which are driving the economy of the state. You look at oil and gas. There's a very large new gas discovery offshore, and how that will impact process. You look at the rail and road infrastructure and how that would relate to different urban centers and how you can drive that and develop a sustainable development plan. Then you look at risk. This is something that we rarely looked at in the past, but especially after Fukushima and what happened a few years back in Japan. Looking at this in an integrated manner is very important. These are hurricanes, and we call them cyclones in this part of the world in India. Look at flood frequency, and in a sense, you have to bring all of these questions together when you are starting to look at let's say, sustainable development. So what I've showed you, of course, are the series of maps, but that is to give you a sense that when we look at these questions, we can't only look at them in silos, looking at them from the point of view, let's say, economic development or social development or environment. We have to put them together, and what the urban SDG gives us is an opportunity to look at these questions in space. So I will now close with a very simple example of one of the more remarkable sustainable city creation processes, which is now almost 50 years old. This was an initiative that was created in southern India in 1968. The idea was to build, this is part of the great 68 revolution, was to create a world city which would have citizens from across the world come to it. It's actually a UNESCO project. I think there are people now from about 70 or 80 countries who are resident there, coming in from 1968. It's a place called Auroville that was quite special in some ways, because this is how it started. This is what it looked like in 1968. This was a parched, degraded coastal plateau in southern India, almost no trees, and very, very serious challenges of water. This is how the landscape looked at that point in time. Tremendous rill erosion. But over a period of time, this is the process. This is how Auroville was created. These are people from, I think at that time 130 countries who came in to participate in the creation of this town. It was based on a revolutionary plan. This is what they call the Galaxy Plan, that integrates the ecological, the social, and the economic plan that was put together by a very famous French designer and planner who spent much of his life trying to sort of help realize this. So again, what we're saying here is that what we talk about here in terms of sort of dramatic economic development or sustainability is not, it's not something that we're creating from scratch. People have thought about this and have tried to implement these ideas for quite a long time, but of course, unfortunately, in too few places in the world. It took about 20 years to start restoring the ecosystems. So the first people who came here essentially spent the first 20 years regrowing the forest. Remember, the early image that I showed you here, the earlier images, if you look at that, that's how it was when it started. 20 years later, it was like this, because people had regrown the forest. And this is what it looks like at the current point of time. So there is a remarkable transformation of the landscape that's there. An old forest that had died away about 200 years ago has come back again, partially because of the influence of people, and then of course the natural pollinators. That is, this one of the central buildings in this process. This is one of the classic examples of how sustainability can be achieved over the long period of time. But the reason I'm showing this to you is to explain two things. The first thing is these transitions are possible. However, they take time and they take tremendous amount of energy and effort and dedication to actually make it possible. This is the classic building that's at the heart of this city, and this is the place that people come to visit from pretty much all over the world. Sometimes you'll have about 15 or 20,000 visitors coming to this building every year. So, in some senses, what I'm saying is that it took the residents of this place almost 40 years to come to the stage where they actually have a system in which the ecological services are in balance with the population, and you have a green environment where water and basic food production for much of this area actually comes from this region. So the reason I show that to you is to give you a sense that, of course, this is possible, but to do this for 5,000, 10,000 people or 100,000 people is difficult enough. To do this for another 1.5 to 2 billion people who are going to be sort of coming in and spending time in urban areas over the next 20, 30 years is a tremendous, tremendous challenge. So we have to start now, and if we don't do that, I think we're going to have more of the same challenges that we have at the current point of time. So I'll stop here and be happy to take questions. Okay. Sweta, you good for questions? So I have about what?
Yep, 15 minutes.
15 minutes, yeah.
Yes. Okay, so can you see the questions on the screen?
No, I can't. I can see you folks.
Why don't you read it out to them?
If you go to the side panel and it says a QA button, where it was the screen share.
Chat, screen share.
Where instead of the screen share, two below that it'll say Q&A.
1 second. Give me a second. Yeah. Oh, can't see anything. Can you read them out for me because I can respond
Sure.
live.
Yeah, you know what? This is from Pilar. I guess UF means University of Florida. In cities like Rome, the creation of clean means of transportation, such as subway, has been very limited because of many of the urban areas are categorized as human heritage protected spaces. So how can cities with these challenges be cleaner? So I guess crowded areas that are heritage sites, how do you kind of have introduced modern transportation as well as modern sanitation?
Okay, Shiv, why don't you give me 2-3 questions and I can pull them up all together.
Okay, from Camilla, also from University of Florida. Urbanization process is also changing the rural role/context, especially in developing countries. Role of cities in promoting sustainable rural, sustainable, I guess, supply chain, rural to supply its demands.
Yeah, okay.
Another one. Wow, today the Floridians are hopping. Third one, also from University of Florida, Christie. Sustainable development in the cities of developed countries often require expensive innovations. How can developing countries maintain the same quality of sustainable development with a low GDP? Then, you want another one?
Okay, I'll take them all.
Okay, University of Florida, Russ. Recognize the intensive water demand of urban centers and the need for improved efficiency in use, point source management, and reclamation. Can we avoid or at least mitigate water wars from becoming commonplace?
Okay, let me start. I'm sorry I don't have them up, but I'll respond to you, as best as I can. So on the Rome question, just an interesting story. We were in Rome about, let's say, 2.5 months ago, and I spent a day and a half with the mayor of Rome and other people in the Vatican, and this is a serious challenge for Rome and for many other cities, because like they say, whenever they dig, they find something that's at least 2,500 years old and maybe older than that. So to balance the needs of conservation, and it's conservation not only for the people of Rome, but of course for the world, because the history of Rome, in some senses, is the history of parts of not only Western civilization but many other parts of the world. So this is a difficult question to deal with, and I guess there are not many cities that have actually been able to build subway systems that take care of this, because it becomes very expensive. For example, I'll give you the example of Delhi. Delhi, we had to tunnel maybe 15 or 20 meters below the old city area, and that increased the price of construction by almost 5 or 6 times, primarily because you wanted to avoid any disturbance to the buildings and the fabric above that. So this is a tough question to deal with, and especially cities which don't have very much money, cities in the global south, have to take a rather difficult call as far as that's concerned. If you have surface transport, then very often emissions will start damaging the buildings or a whole range of other questions. If you go subsurface, then it increases the cost dramatically, and in some cases you may not be able to build. So these are tricky questions that need site-specific answers. There are no generalizations that will work for that. On the question of expensive innovation, I think if you look at informal settlements across the world, whether it's in Latin America or let's say in sub-Saharan Africa or even in Asia, informal settlements give you a sense of how effective human innovation can work. People often look at them and say, look, these are horrible places to live in. But in actual fact, given the complexity of the lives of people who live in them, there's tremendous amount of innovation that's happening there, and really productive activity. I'm not trying to sort of romanticize the difficulty that people have. But what I'm saying is that innovation exists in a particular context. You'll find a whole range of innovations that work in a, let's say, an OECD context that is completely useless and impossible to apply in other parts of the world. So development, in a sense, is responding to context, and the innovation that you find, and we have a particular word for it in India. It's called jugaad. It actually means, it's been translated into MIT. Sort of, let's say, in Western terms, into what is called frugal innovation. So frugal innovation is where I think most of the cutting-edge technology companies are going at the moment to try and make things work more effectively. On the question of the rural and the urban are very closely related. Most cities cannot survive on their own. They require the ecosystem services, the availability of food, of water, of a whole range of other services that come from rural areas. So keeping the balance is very critical, but that comes from our own imagination of how the world has to be structured, and often the imagination structures things into black and white. So I think partitioning things into rural and urban doesn't make sense in a world in which there's actually a transition from one to the other. But as we know from the experience of many parts of the global south, managing cities more effectively is a very effective way to deal with rural poverty, because exactly what you're suggesting there, of the linkages, people move back and forth, remittances move back and forth between cities and other places. So the connections are actually quite strong and important. And I think in some ways, in a particular way, China has been able to deal with this in some, relatively effectively, as have many countries in Southeast Asia. And on the question of water wars, well, water wars are a very serious challenge, and especially in semi-arid and arid areas, this is a matter of great concern and also survival for urban dwellers, because one of the most important medium range impacts of decreased precipitation or changes in variability in precipitation is going to be both drought and flooding. So that's in those conditions, there will be battles between upstream and downstream locations, and even in California, if you've seen the whole the way that water resources have been handled across California, across the water divide in the western U.S., this is going to be an important question for us to deal with in the future. But as a wrap up on that, when we're dealing with sustainable cities, we have to deal with questions that are in context, and there are no universal solutions that can be applied from one geography to the other. Some things are universal, but especially in terms of resource management, in terms of how you manage land, how you manage energy, and how you manage land use, they have to be situated within the context we're talking about. So one has to invert the conventional sort of wisdom of building cities when the world is completely empty. We have to first, in some senses today, have to design the ecosystem services, sort of help them become robust in terms of both climate change and other risks, and then situate the built environment within that framework. I think I'm almost up in terms of time. We can take another few questions. Yeah, another 5 minutes is good. Shiv, I can't hear you. You're muted there, I think. Still muted, can't hear you.
Now?
Yes,
okay.
Now it's good.
From Columbia University, two questions. The first one, almost 70% of Africans who live in urban areas reside in informal settlements. How do you suggest we address creating stable, affordable housing while also creating housing to be more energy efficient, which can often be costly? Okay, so housing, expensive, informality. That's first. Second is, Aishwarya, a crucial urban planning challenge is determining who receives access to subsidized housing when the population is largely migratory. This also makes recording the population difficult, affecting implementation of these schemes. How do we resolve? Okay, and maybe one last one. This is from Hango. In the documents that I have read, most of the women depend on the informal sector. How to develop a poor country without the help of the women, while the world of human rights treats a man and a woman the same. This is it. How to develop a poor country without the help of the women. Not quite getting this. Anyway, I leave it to you. You're the guy who's answering this.
Okay, good. Thank you. Yeah. So I'll answer the last question first. It's impossible to actually develop any part of the world, at least in my opinion and experience, without women being central to the process. And of course, we know that there are tremendous asymmetries in the way that the world actually works. We have to work very, very actively to be able to try and address those questions. The SDGs clearly try and do that, but it's going to be an uphill task. And this is from birth onwards. In many parts of the world, we live in deeply patriarchal cultures. We need to change that quite centrally. And cities really are a test of both potential and the challenges we have in that space. On the question of informal settlements, of course, I mean, it's not only Africa that has large proportions of people living in informal settlements. I think what we have to understand is informal settlements are not the problem. They're actually a remarkable response to a whole set of very, very difficult constraints. Usually people come to informal settlements or even to cities primarily to find a livelihood, sometimes to educate their children. It is because public delivery of services are actually quite poor, that land markets also don't work and housing is not available, that people actually subsidize the city and effectively the richer people in the city by living and working in those conditions. So informal settlements are part of the solution. The challenge, of course, is that in many informal settlements across the world, we have the sense that they shouldn't be where they should be because very often they're in the heart of the city because that's where you find the employment, that you should bulldoze them or you should upgrade them or you should gentrify them. In actual fact, if you allow people the opportunity to invest in their environments, you provide them basic services and security of tenure, and in some cases, support for housing, they will actually over 20 or 30 years, certainly in one, maybe in 2 generations, actually transform those environments. This is something that we've known for 50 years. This has been very effectively sort of supported across Latin America, some parts of Africa, and certainly some parts of Asia. So I would say informal settlements are part of the solution. They're certainly not part of the problem. And then to respond to the question of subsidized housing, subsidies sometimes create tremendous distortions in market-based environments. The challenge, of course, is that we need to understand what kind of housing or for what sets of people, what instruments work well. So obviously, in most environments, even in the global south, there will be some people who can afford to build their own houses or who can afford to live in rental housing that's been created by developers. But there may be a large proportion of people who can't afford to do that. So there, from the people who are on the footpaths or on the pavements or on the sidewalks, all the way up to other people, you need to put together a set of interventions that makes it accessible. Because as soon as you do that, and you don't involve yourselves in too much of distortion of the market by using too many subsidies, people are able to hopefully look after themselves. So the entitlements, especially in terms of tenure, in terms of access to basic services, locational access in terms of employment, these are fairly well-known sort of interventions that enable us to respond to these questions. And once you do that, these distortions tend to go away. Fine? So I'm sorry, I'll have to leave you quite quickly, otherwise I'm going to sort of unfortunately miss my flight.
Okay. No.
I hope we had a decent time, you could hear me, and we'll catch up sometime later.
Yeah, sure. Thank you, Aro. And so sorry for the rest of you who have sent in your excellent questions. So thank you, Aro. So hope to see you soon.
Yeah. Cheers then. Bye.
All right. Okay. Bye-bye.
Thank you.